Good afternoon. My name is Danny Smith, and I am the City of Albany's Housing Services Advocate, as well as the Program Facilitator for the City of Albany's Good Neighbors School. Thank you for joining me, and welcome to this webinar about finding and applying for housing. The Good Neighbors School program is a grant-funded initiative intended to help landlords and tenants alike identify resources that can help them recover during the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as to help them better understand their rights and responsibilities. If you're newer to Zoom, you'll see either at the top or the bottom of your screen, there should be a control panel. You can use the Q&A or the chat feature to ask any questions that you may have, and I'll be stopping periodically throughout the presentation to address those. And you're also welcome to reach out to me. My contact information will be at the back of this presentation. Feel free to let me know if you have any additional questions or items you'd like to connect about offline, or if you have any ideas for future programming. Again, we'd love to hear from you. So with all of that being said, we'll go ahead and get started with finding and applying for housing from the Good Neighbor School. So this workshop will provide information to help people deal with issues in searching for and securing an affordable and safe place to live. So we'll talk about where to find rental listings, as well as evaluating different rental listings, how to evaluate a potential landlord in a potential apartment. We will also touch on applying for housing, as well as barriers and overcoming barriers to housing. And then we will discuss, nope, that's it. So the first thing to consider is our housing needs versus wants. So the first thing that we need to do before we even start our housing search is to have considered what we need in our housing. So these would be the things that we must have in order to be safe and comfortable, versus the things that would be nice to have but are not necessary to live. So your housing needs would include things like having running water and heat in the property. Depending on your situation, your needs are obviously going to be more specific. Wants are things that would be nice to have, but aren't technically necessary. So for most people, a dishwasher is going to be a want, but not necessarily a need. And if you are financially in a pinch, you may have to give up some of your wants in order to get your needs at a price you can afford. The next thing is to know what you can afford. So one of the first steps that you want to take when you're looking for a place to live is to figure out how much you can afford to pay for rent each month, including all of the other expenses associated with your housing. So this could include things like utilities, parking, that might vary depending on where you live, and any other expenses such as laundry. So maybe you would have to pay for laundry outside of your building, anything else like that that's going to be dependent on your housing. In general, a good rule of thumb is to try and keep your housing costs to within about 1/3 of your take-home pay. The reason for that is that if you're spending more than 1/3 of your take-home pay on housing costs, then it can start to eat into your ability to pay for other necessities like food or childcare. So where do we find rental listings? So these websites are not necessarily endorsed by the City of Albany at all, but they can be helpful in finding affordable rental units. A lot of the times they have a lot of options and they're updated regularly. So these might include HUD's Resource Locator, New York Housing Search, Craigslist, Facebook, rent.com, apartments.com, forrent.com, Apartment Guide, Pad Mapper, Hot Pads, and there are many others out there as well. One thing that is really important to touch on as well, though, when we're discussing finding housing online, is to be super, super careful to avoid scams. So you'll want to be really careful that you're not sending money or any personal information to someone you haven't met in person yet. And the same goes for renting a unit. You don't want to rent a unit or put a deposit down on a unit that you haven't seen first. We have gotten reports of scams that are happening in Albany, and my office has actually gotten involved in a couple of these to try and intervene in preventing some of these from happening. So it is happening, and you'll just want to be really careful when you're looking for housing online. Make sure that you verify who you're talking to first. However, searching for listings online isn't the only way to find a place to live. A couple other ideas that include walking or driving around the neighborhood you want to live in. A lot of the times rental listings aren't even posted online in certain neighborhoods. So you could try checking in community areas that have bulletin boards, such as grocery stores, bodegas, gas stations, libraries, churches, community centers, really anywhere that would have a bulletin board where people would post community advertisements. Depending on your circumstances, you may also be able to access a HUD certified housing counselor to help you in your rental search. And if that's something you're interested in, you can call HUD at 1-800-569-4287, or you can also visit www.hud.gov/I-want-to-talk-to-a-housing-counselor. Another idea is to contact local housing service providers or nonprofit agencies for leads. The reason for this is that these agencies often maintain listings of affordable rental units, or there may also be some assistance programs that you're eligible for that you didn't even realize you were eligible for. So the next couple slides are just a listing of some of our housing providers here in Albany, and feel free to take a screenshot or write down any of their contact information. I'll pause for a moment in between each slide. So we have Albany County Department of Social Services, or DSS. So they administer our financial assistance program, also known as temporary assistance, or TA, for Albany County. They also work a lot with individuals and families coming out of homelessness. We also have the Albany Housing Authority, who administers our federal Section 8 and other voucher programs. And they also maintain our public housing residences. Catholic Charities Housing Office, they work with a lot of people experiencing homelessness and housing instability. They provide rental assistance at times. They maintain some rental units as well, but they also provide a lot of wraparound services in addition to that. There's also HADIS, or the Homeless and Travelers Aid Society. They maintain a monthly listing of available housing units in Albany, as well as providing rapid rehousing services for people who are unhoused. I'll go ahead and pause for a moment. Legal Aid Society of Northeastern New York. So they obviously provide free civil legal services to tenants in New York. However, they also have their own housing program called STEP, which is for families coming out of homelessness. So they do work with as a housing provider as well. And then finally, United Tenants can sometimes provide financial assistance to tenants who are in the process of moving, depending on your situation. And they may also be able to help connect tenants who are looking for housing to landlords who have housing available. So they're another good organization to try if you are in the process of moving or looking for somewhere to go. I'll go ahead and pause for a moment if there's any questions about searching for housing or starting the housing search. All right. So the next section of this presentation is going to be about how you compare and evaluate rental units once you've identified some rental units that you might be interested in. So one way of doing this, again, when you're at the beginning of your search, is to create a needs and wants checklist. So it's really good idea to do this before you begin. The way this works is that you would go through a housing needs and wants checklist, which we will have on the next couple slides. So basically the items that you check as very important, the factors that are the most important would be your needs or your must-haves. The items that you check as important may be your needs or your wants. They may be your nice-to-haves, but may not be essential. That would sort of depend on what they are and what your prioritizing is. And then you will have items that may not be important to you, and those will be things that you won't need to consider. You may also have some items that aren't included on the list, and you're welcome to add those as well. You're welcome to use our needs and wants checklist or to create your own, of course. However, you'll definitely want to prioritize your very important items when you start your search for rental housing, as opposed to your not important. So this is an example of a blank needs and wants checklist. So your prioritizing would most likely be different from someone else's depending on your situation. So for a family looking for a place to live, you may prioritize having a safe area where children can play outside, maybe having a single family residence, and having a higher number of bedrooms. Someone who is a single young adult may prefer to live in an apartment building with other young people around. They may not have a car, and maybe they would rather be close to a bus stop. And maybe being close to work is more important to them. They may not care whether or not there is a bathtub for their children because maybe they don't have children. So in that way, you can sort of narrow down what you're looking for, and this can be a really helpful tool to sort of get a better sense of what you're looking for going into your housing search. So in addition to your neighborhood, building, and apartment characteristics, which we just talked about a couple examples, you'll also want to think about what sort of landlord you would want to rent from. So a couple ideas would be that there's a landlord or at least a manager or an agent, someone local or nearby who could take care of any issues that arise. And then you'll also want to most likely rent from a landlord or an agent or manager who you get a good sense from. They seem trustworthy and upstanding. And then if there's any other characteristics that you would like to see in your landlord, you also are welcome to keep that in mind as well. So we also have a list of questions that you may find helpful to ask a potential landlord when you're looking at units. So some of these could be about the unit, such as how soon are you looking to fill this apartment? How long is the lease term? Questions about how much the rent is or where you pay rent is really important, just so you have a good idea of that going in. It's a really good idea to ask about what their typical rent increase is up front so that you don't get, if you do plan on staying there for maybe a couple years, you're not getting a big surprise in between the first and second year. You can also ask what their general rental policies are like. And a lot of the times, if you ask a landlord if you can see a copy of their sample lease just to get an idea of their general policies, a lot of the times they'll say yes. You can also ask about utilities, such as if any utilities are included in the rent or how much utilities are on average. And legally, if you ask a landlord for the last 2 years of utility statements for the apartment, they are required by law to give you those. So they do have to give you an idea of what you'd be paying in utilities. You can also ask the landlord if there's any issues with noise or crime in the neighborhood. And you can also ask them what they think about the unit or the neighborhood. So ask them, what do you like most about this apartment? Or what do you like most about this neighborhood? Another thing that's good to ask a potential landlord up front is about their maintenance policies. So who takes care of maintenance if any maintenance issues arise, and how long does it usually take? Again, if you have a landlord that is nearby and they do their maintenance, great. If they don't live nearby, then maybe they have someone close by who can take care of their maintenance in a relatively short period of time. Then again, that would be another good sign. You can also ask how long tenants usually stay in their units. What do they think makes someone a good tenant, or what are they looking for in a tenant? That can be a really helpful question so that you get a better idea of what they might be looking for when you're filling out your application. And then just other practical logistics, such as what parking options are available, maybe if there's storage in the building, or where you can do laundry. So before we get into the individual sort of logistics of evaluating a rental unit, there are some sort of universal red flags, yellow flags, and green flags. So I like to use sort of a stoplight system for these. Things you might want to consider when you're looking at a potential rental unit. So your red light signs, I would say, would be you would want to most likely avoid renting this unit altogether. These are definitely going to be red flags if you go into a unit and these things are present. So if you go in and the unit is very dirty or in disrepair, if there are visible code violations, so if you go to visit a unit and there's broken windows, you see pests, faulty plumbing and electrical fixtures, anything like that. If you're aware that the unit doesn't have a residential occupancy permit or an ROP and the landlord doesn't seem willing to get one, or maybe if you've asked the landlord about the ROP and they aren't willing to tell you about that. If the landlord is located outside of the Albany area, again, and if they don't have anyone local to handle routine maintenance or business issues, you can see how that might be an issue if your plumbing breaks in the middle of the night and your landlord is 2 states away and no one is around to fix that. That could definitely become an issue for you. And again, if you notice your landlord's policies violate federal or state fair housing laws, or just generally make you feel uncomfortable or seem suspicious. So for example, if you have a potential landlord who is refusing to rent to certain groups of people, or maybe if you see a listing that says no Section 8 or DSS, that's also against the law, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Those are going to be kind of red flags that might indicate other negative behaviors in other areas as well, even if that doesn't affect you. So then we'll get into what I would consider to be your yellow light signs. So these would be sort of areas where you might want to proceed with caution. Maybe if you notice 1 or 2 of these, it might not be a super big deal. But if you are noticing enough of these, you may wish to reconsider whether or not you want to rent from this person. So if the unit is really dirty, in disrepair, has major code violations, but if the landlord offers to fix them before you move in, if the unit does not have a valid ROP, but the landlord is willing to apply, maybe the common areas such as the lobbies or the hallways or outdoor areas are neglected, but the inside of the apartment is okay. If you're having a hard time getting a hold of the landlord before you've moved in, you can imagine what that might be like even after you've moved in. If the building or the area is noisy or seems unsafe. And one tip for this is to try visiting a potential rental at different times of day to see what it might be like to live there. So you could try visiting in the morning to see what rush hour traffic would be like. And you could also try visiting at night to see if it seems safe or like somewhere that you would be comfortable walking around. You may also wish to proceed with caution if the landlord is pressuring you into making a decision or into applying really quickly. If the landlord or the other tenants mention a lot of surprise fees or charges or just sort of unexpected money pits, or if the landlord speaks poorly about other tenants, current or former. So with all of that being said, what are some good signs to look out for when you're looking at a potential unit? So if the unit isn't clean and in good repair, that's obviously a great sign. If the landlord seems knowledgeable about the property and the neighborhood, that's awesome. If they are friendly and seem sincere and trustworthy, if they speak respectfully about their other tenants and to their other tenants, that's also a really good sign. The landlord should be able and willing to answer questions about their policies in the unit. Remember, this is someone you are considering entering a business relationship with, so they should be willing to answer your questions and they should be able to answer your questions. If there's a property manager on site or nearby, or if the landlord is local, that's also a good sign. And if you have an opportunity to talk to the other tenants in the building or other tenants of that landlord and they have a good opinion about the landlord, that's also usually a good sign before you're renting from them. So with all of that being said, when it comes to viewing the particular units that you are looking at, you probably will look at a fair number of units, and you may wish to have a tool to organize the information that you'll get about each different apartment. So a tool like a rental comparison chart can be really helpful to do that. So this is an example of a rental comparison chart from the city of Albany. You're welcome to use this or make your own, of course. But it basically just helps you to organize some of the basic information about each property. So this would include the upfront cost of moving expenses. So your first month deposit, your application fee for each property, your monthly costs, so you can get a better idea of what it would really cost you each month to live there, your neighborhood characteristics. And then we also have building characteristics, apartment characteristics, and then also considering the different landlord characteristics as well as some of the lease terms and conditions that you would be agreeing to. And if you're interested in any of these documents, you of course can take a screenshot of these. You also are able to download these from the city link on city. All right, so the remainder of this presentation is going to focus on getting through the application process, especially if you are maybe someone who has some barriers to housing. So when it comes to filling out a housing application, this is your opportunity to make a good first impression on your future landlord. So in order to do this, you can fill out an application that is complete, truthful, and neat. This can help show a potential landlord that you would be a good tenant for them. Filling out an application that's missing information or is dishonest can actually give them a reason legally to deny your application, so you don't want to do that. A lot of the times, landlords will charge an application fee just to cover the costs of background and credit checks. And in New York State, property managers actually can only charge application fees that cover the actual costs of their screenings. And the maximum is $20. So if you see application fees that are more than $20, that's actually against the law. Another thing to keep in mind is that before you're submitting your application and paying any fees, you want to make sure that you really understand the landlord's screening criteria, such as any expectations that they might have about your income limits or your rental history. The reason for that is that you'll only want to apply to a unit if you're really serious about living there. I would recommend applying for units one at a time. So maybe apply for your top choice, see how it goes, then look at applying for other units as opposed to just applying for all of them and seeing what happens. Again, the reason for that is that some of these screening services do tell landlords how many other listings you've applied for, and it can make it seem like you've been rejected from a lot of other listings, which can make landlords reluctant to rent to you because they might think there's something questionable in your background that's making these other landlords turn you down, when in reality that might not even be the case. You may not even be getting denied, but you've just submitted so many applications. And I've touched on this before, but if a landlord makes you feel rushed or pressured to finish your application, it's totally normal and acceptable to ask to take the application home and to turn it in later. So the next couple slides will have a sample rental application. You might find it helpful to fill out the sample rental application while you are in the process of searching for housing, because then you can use the sample rental application to fill out any real rental applications. You'll already have all the information together. And again, this is available to download from the City of Albany's website as well. So the types of information that you might commonly be asked would include your name, social security number, your current address, as well as a few years worth of rental history, your employment and income information. It's not uncommon to be asked about an emergency contact or about the other people who will live in the apartment. There may be a few rental screening questions. Some of these questions may be asked, but sometimes the information cannot be used to deny you for housing, but the questions are still able to be asked anyways. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then the landlord will most likely ask for some personal references as well. So what if you're someone who has barriers to housing? So if you are completing a rental application and you realize that your landlord may uncover some negative information about you on a credit report or background check, one way to address this situation would be to write a brief letter explaining your history and to include that with your rental application. This helps you to sort of get in front of that and helps your landlord to understand your side of the story from your perspective. So if you made a mistake at a previous rental unit, you can have the opportunity to tell your landlord what you've done or what you will do differently in this situation. Or maybe you were involved in the past in a situation that wasn't necessarily your fault, and writing a letter explaining that can help you to reassure the landlord that you won't have those problems anymore. So what does this look like? This is a template that can be helpful when you're writing a letter to explain your situation. At my old apartment, blank happened. This was because blank. Since that time, I have blank. I hope that blank. So another way to go about this would be to practice explaining your situation to a family member or a friend, someone you trust. And then once you're comfortable doing that, you can try writing it down in your own words, and that can sort of go into being your letter. So let's look at a couple examples of what this might actually look like. At my last apartment, I fell behind on rent due to COVID-19. I applied for rental assistance, and that helped me get caught up. In the future, I will set up automatic bank transfers to make sure my rent is paid on time. I hope that my struggles during the pandemic will not prevent you from renting to me, because I believe I will be an excellent tenant. So this follows the formula that I discussed in the previous slide. So at my last apartment, I fell behind on rent due to COVID. That's what happened. And that may come up when the landlord talks to the tenant's previous landlord or when they pull a credit check. The tenant also mentions what they did to recover from that situation. So they applied for rental assistance. They did get caught up. They also touch on what they're going to do in the future to prevent that from happening again, setting up automatic bank transfers. And then there is a statement of a desired outcome. I hope that my struggles will not prevent you from renting to me. The second example is in regards to a situation where maybe this tenant wasn't necessarily at fault, but they were still living in a household with someone who was causing problems, and they still wish to address that situation, again, in case maybe this landlord was going to talk to their previous landlord and that conversation could arise. My former roommate used to have big parties late at night. Even though I wasn't involved with the parties, our landlord got upset with both of us. Because of that situation, I will not allow this person to visit me at my new apartment. I hope that the actions of my old roommate will not keep you from renting to me. So again, the tenant expresses what happened. They do admit it and take ownership of it. They do express what they're going to do in the future so that this doesn't happen again by not allowing the person to visit them at the new apartment. And again, they express their desired outcome. I hope the actions of my old roommate will not prevent you from renting to me. And in case you're interested, there is an example of a full-length letter with a header and a signature and everything available to download on the City of Albany's website. And I'll go ahead and pause for a moment in case there's any questions about applying for housing or barriers to housing. All right, the final section is going to cover rental application screening practices and fair housing laws. So as we've touched on briefly, a lot of landlords do use tenant screening services to help them evaluate rental applications. These services a lot of the times will collect information about a prospective tenant, such as your credit history, or will run a background check on you. Landlords, of course, can use their own methods of evaluating rental applications, but they do have to follow state and federal fair housing laws. So the Fair Housing Act is a federal law that requires landlords to treat all of their tenants equally, regardless of their personal characteristics. When landlords do not provide this equal treatment to their tenants, then that's called housing discrimination. So some examples of what housing discrimination would look like would include giving one applicant for housing priority over another, refusing to make repairs for certain tenants, refusing to rent to certain types of people, telling someone that housing is unavailable when this is not the case. And we do see that a lot, where housing may still be available and a landlord may tell one applicant that it's off the market. Requiring higher rents or different lease conditions for the same accommodations, and denying certain tenants access to services or facilities. So in New York State, tenants actually have a couple more protections than they do under federal law. So in New York State, it's illegal for landlords to treat tenants differently because of their race or ethnicity, your national origin or which country you come from, your biological sex or your gender identity, your sexual orientation, such as whether you're a member of the LGBTQ+ community, your religion, your familial status, to include whether you're married or if you have children. It is illegal for a landlord to tell you that you can't have children in a unit. Any disabilities that you may have, including mental health conditions, and any lawful sources of income, to include Section 8, Social Security, child support, alimony, anything else like that. Again, any lawful source of income. So what information can a landlord ask for when you're applying for housing? Landlords are allowed to ask you for the following information on your application. They can ask about your date of birth, your Social Security number, your monthly income, your employment status, your credit score, who will live in the unit, your rental history, and references. But there are caveats to a couple of these. So as I mentioned, landlords can ask you about your employment status, but they cannot refuse to rent to you if you use another lawful source of income. So for example, if maybe you don't work due to disability, but you do have enough income to cover your rent through Social Security or Section 8, that's a perfectly lawful source of income, and they cannot refuse to rent to you because of that. In terms of who lives in the unit, your landlord is allowed to ask you who will live in the unit, especially when it comes to screening fellow adult renters. But they cannot prohibit them from living in the unit. They cannot prohibit your children from living there as long as the unit will not be overcrowded. So if it's a studio apartment and you have 6 children who are going to be living there, then it would be legal for a landlord to say that that would be overcrowding and you couldn't have them moving in there. But other than that, in most situations, if they have just a blanket no children policy, then that would be against the law. Information that cannot be requested. Landlords are not allowed to ask you about your marital status, your race or ethnicity, your religion, your gender, your sexual orientation, or your participation in public assistance or benefits. So again, a caveat to this would be your participation in public assistance may be relevant in terms of you may use a program such as DSS or Section 8 to help you pay your rent. However, it would be inappropriate for a landlord to ask you whether you receive other benefits such as SNAP or food stamps, Medicare, anything like that. So, what do you do if you believe you've been treated unfairly? You have a few options. The first would be to contact the New York State Division of Human Rights, Albany Regional Office. You can reach them by phone at 518-474-2705. You can also visit their website at dhr.ny.gov. The Legal Aid Society of Northeastern New York is another local option, and their legal helpline is 833-628-0087. And finally, you can contact the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, at 1-800-955-2232 or HUD.org. And that brings us to the end of today's presentation. So unless there are any questions, I'll go ahead and let you know that tomorrow I do have a pair of webinars about signing a lease and just the process of moving in, moving out, important things to know. So those will be tomorrow, Tuesday, December 21st at 11 a.m. and 4 p.m. On Wednesday, December 29th at 4 p.m., I will be holding a session of tenants' rights. So that essentially covers basics of being a renter in Albany, things you should know, protections for tenants, basic code education, things like that. And on Thursday, December 30th at 4 p.m., I will be hosting legal processes and protections for tenants. This discusses the basics of civil court for tenants, as well as the eviction process, what that looks like, and how to file a civil lawsuit against your landlord if that's something you feel like you need to do. And with that, this is my contact information. I can be reached by email at dsmith@albanyny.gov. That is the best way to reach me. I can also be reached by phone at 518-694-0066. And if you're interested in downloading any of the materials used in today's webinar, you can also visit albanyny.gov/1985/finding-applying-for-housing. And you are welcome to visit that site to see all of this information there again and download any of our materials. So once again, thank you so much for joining on tonight's webinar, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Have a great night.